From the age of 3, I have wanted to knit and crochet. When I was very young, the maternal parental was friends with a woman who put the fun in dysfunctional. In that friendship came friendship with her 3 sisters and brother. One was just slightly dysfunctional, while the other 2 were, for all intents and purposes, seemingly normal, as was the brother. Slightly dysfunctional sister had 3 daughters, 2 of which were dysfunctional and one who was quiet and seemingly normal as well. It's from her that I first witnessed the crafts of knitting and crocheting. One day, while avoiding being bullied by the other 2 daughters, I came across sane daughter in her room doing something with a hook. Not understanding what she was doing, I quietly observed her as she used her metal stick and jabbed it into an ever-growing piece of fabric. As it turned out, she was crocheting a blanket using what must have been a G-hook, but I didn't know this at 3 years old. Seeing this happen was like magic to me, and I watched her until I was called by the maternal parental so we could go home. From that moment on, I wanted to learn what sane daughter was doing. Another time I came across her using 2 metal sticks connected to a wire, this was the early 80s, to make what looked like a little sweater. Again, I was transfixed by what I saw, and for her part, sane daughter wasn't annoyed with my presence, so she let me watch her create this tiny article of clothing until it was again time for me to leave for home. I liked sane daughter. Time went on, and the maternal parental eventually fell out with super dysfunctional sister over something or other. After that, we lost contact with the whole family. I wasn't too broken up over that because super dysfunctional sister and slightly dysfunctional sister had a majority of my early childhood tormentors as children. I was only really friendly with super awesome sister and super awesome quiet brother's kids. The rest, saving sane daughter, would tease and pick on me. Lost with the friendship, though, was my only connection to someone who knew how to knit and crochet. I didn't, nor did I want to know, anyone in my neighborhood who might be able to teach me. No one in my family that I knew of knew these strange crafts. I also had no resources on where and how I could learn these things. It would be a mystery to me for almost a decade, but it would be omnipresent in my mind. One day, while I was in high school in the auditorium, I watched as a friend of me turned friend of mine focused all her attention on 2 metal sticks connected to a wire while creating a material out of pink yarn. She was making a little toy, and I was again transfixed by what I saw. I asked her what she was doing, and she explained that she was knitting. The puzzled look on my face caused her to follow her question up with another asking whether I had ever seen someone knit before. Not wanting to get into the entire history of the dysfunctional family, I only nodded and watched as she continued her knitting her toy. By then, I had a name for one of the tasks I wanted to learn. Knitting was on my mind from that moment onward. I couldn't learn it from school because they had rules against us having sharp objects without adult supervision, so I kept it in the back of my mind until such time as I was able to follow through on my goal of learning how to do it. It would take me 9 years before I would have a chance to hold knitting needles. By this point, I was 25 years old and in mortal terror of making the attempt of learning to knit. Thus began my fear of knitting, but also my conquering of that fear. One day, around the time of my 25th birthday, I decided I must learn to knit. By then, we had moved into a stable neighborhood, and I was mentally stable enough, even if ragged around the psychological edges. I had come a long way from near complete mental breakdown up to this point, and I was determined to treat myself with a self-obtained accomplishment. Knitting was to be this accomplishment, even if I had to bleed for it. So taking my meager savings, I brought a pounder skein of black yarn from Amazon along with the cheapest straight needles I could find. I ended up with a pound of Karen's 1-pound yarn and a pair of 10-inch size 8 Susan Bates knitting needles. I was overjoyed to finally have the implements of knitting, but I didn't know the first thing about how to knit. I searched high and low on the internet, but to no avail. This was 2006 after all. There was nothing there except a few sites and a few videos online. Not having luck with searching online, I decided to go to the library website to see if they had any materials related to knitting. Wow, am I ever glad I did that. They not only had materials related to knitting, but they also had an upcoming class at the Catonsville Library being taught by a famous knitting woman. I had no clue who she was at the time, but the words free knitting class had me rushing to register. Luckily for me, there was still room in the class for a few more people. I was given the requirements for the class as well as the date and the time to show up at the library. I showed up at the appointed time in the neighborhood I was barely familiar with. I was about 20 minutes early, so I spent my time fiddling with my needles and yarn while waiting for class to begin. Once I got the all clear to go to the classroom, off I went to the first lesson with sweaty palms and a leaping frog in my stomach. The class was comprised of all women of varying ages and backgrounds, all there for a single purpose, to knit. One of the library staff was there to introduce the famous knitting woman who turned out to be Nikki Epstein. In addition to Nikki Epstein, there were 3 teaching assistants who did most of the teaching. Once everyone had been introduced, class was started. There was a knot and a skein of yarn being used for demonstration purposes, and I was given an opportunity to show my party trick of getting near impossible knots out of bits of string. Nikki Epstein had gone to retrieve the scissors, and before she could make it across the room, I had already gotten the knot out. She could hardly believe her eyes, and I just shrugged and said that it was my talent before getting self-conscious. The class went well, and after the last 2 students, a mother and young daughter, showed up, we all settled into casting on the initial stitches. I was so nervous about dropping my needles that I held on for dear life and cast on stitches so tightly they could scarcely be pierced. After a few tries, I managed to cast on reasonably loose stitches via the long-tail cast-on method and began attempting to knit. Nikki Epstein saw how I was knitting with the stitches far from the point and suggested I move them up to the very tip to aid my knitting to become speedier. However, I was so nervous I kept dropping stitches and eventually fell into a habit of keeping them back, which has stayed with me even up to this day. Soon the class was coming to its end, and Nikki Epstein made suggestions of things we should buy, books we should read, and tools we should consider acquiring to aid in our progress as knitters. By then it was dark, and after saying goodbye to everyone, I walked back to the dark bus stop in a daze that I had finally learned something of the basics of knitting. However, on getting home, I began doing something wrong, and I knew it, but didn't know how to fix the error. It would be from 20 June 2006 until 6th of August 2006 until I finally found a fix for my problem. All during the summer, I focused on reading knitting books and practicing by knitting on the object until my hands bled. I'm not kidding. My hands got blisters and bled from the amount of practice I got in on those needles and yarn. Yet try as I might, nothing I did seemed to fix the problem of the extra stitch. I didn't know what I was doing, but for some reason I went from 10 stitches to 11 and onward until I had an unwieldy project sitting on my aluminum knitting needles. Still, I kept it even as my hands bled and my eyes turned bloodshot from so many hours of staring at the same project. I didn't give up. One day in August, we got a call that my maternal grandfather was in the hospital. Apparently, my uncle from my grandfather's second marriage contacted the family via my aunt. We were invited to a cookout to give the family a chance to know each other. Less than 1 week later, my grandfather was dead from his illness. The stress of having to deal with so much during that time drove me to escape into a world of knitting. Giving up on the object, I searched high and low on the internet again until I came across Knitting Help, the website that we all know and love today, Knitting Help, which includes the forum. Amy Finley's videos quite literally kept me sane as I learned to properly knit for the first time since June. I practiced through the night until the morning of the wake. Once we were at the funeral home, I retreated further into my knitting and managed a pretty decent-looking beginner scarf. For the first time, but not the last time, knitting kept me from blowing my top at an inappropriate time. Slowly but surely, I began to increase my knitting skills. Over time, I mastered stitch after stitch until the challenges were intermediate to advanced. I discovered many different learning media, from Knit and Crochet Today, later called Knit and Crochet Now, to DVDs available in the library, and even videos on YouTube that all taught how to knit in easy-to-follow instructions. I was hooked from that moment on, but by then a new fire was burning inside of me. I started seeing things on crocheting and knew I had to learn how to do that as well. Thankfully, I had resources from which to learn by this point. I brought a crochet hook set for myself and checked books out of the library on the subject. I eyed Drew Borski's and Robin Chichula's techniques like a hawk as I watched on television what was then my favorite knitting show. Yet try as I might, I just couldn't seem to pick it up initially. Unlike knitting, I didn't do it until my fingers bled, but I did try hard. However, something inside me just couldn't pick up the craft of crocheting. So thinking a class might help, I signed up for the first crocheting class I saw online at the Women's Industrial Exchange. I tried very hard through my nervousness, but only managed mostly through the back loops scarf of crocheted fabric. I needed something more in-depth and searched online for another free class. Thankfully, the Baltimore Free School had classes available for learning to crochet. One class schedule in particular offered a month's worth of classes, and I jumped at the opportunity. On October 10th, 2009, I walked through the dark street of Baltimore to the free school class site. It was a pleasant night and not so bad neighborhood, but I was still cautious of my surroundings because of my history. I made it to the class site in one piece and was welcomed by a large class of men and women who were all interested in learning the art of crocheting. The teacher was a nice woman named Lissa D, and she was instrumental in my learning to crochet finally. Through watching her and studying her stitch key, I was finally able to pick up the correct method of crocheting. I immediately went home with this skill and practiced until I got the hang of it. By this point, I had a marginal yarn stash, so I took out some royal blue yarn and eventually made a soap cozy / scrubbing thing. This was my first completed crocheted project, and I was very proud. I sent an email to Lissa D and told her what I had done, and she was very encouraging. Regretfully, I didn't go to any of the other classes due to illness, but I credit this class with teaching me to crochet. After I did this first project, I went back to watching Knit and Crochet Today and watched Drew Borski making the Blushing Granny's Afghan. I wanted to make a blanket, and it seemed a good place to start to learn flat crocheting of motifs. At first, I really messed up, but after the third try, I finally got it right. Ultimately, I didn't make that particular project, but it did set me on the path of making the 5x5 Crazy First blanket and other motif-containing projects. Over time, my allegiance switched from knit and crochet now to knitting daily, circa 100 to 1100, due to my appetite for knitting and crocheting needing more of a challenge. As of today, I am successfully able to knit and crochet with minimal issues. I've even learned via YouTube to read patterns and charts. And that's that. So, I was going to read a book, but yeah, I don't want a copyright strike, even though the book is from like 1955. So, I'm going to upload this in a few minutes. I have to overlay this on the podcast that I was going to put up, and hopefully there'll be no problems. Sorry about the delay. Thank you for your patience. Yeah, I'm not feeling too well today, which is why you're getting this. Have a good one. Good night.